Thank you. Good morning again. So this today's my lecture is going to be more about the regulatory framework that's we all have to work with in terms of doing cell therapy. Probably this is the most least interesting for many of us because none of us are, at least I'm not a regulator or a administrative type of framework, but I think as many new, more types of cell therapies are being introduced, actually having done this for like almost 20 years, I think I'm now appreciating the need to have regulations. And like we talked briefly yesterday, the need for regulation is multifold. One is so we all work together in terms of using the same type of language, same type of verbiage, same type of roadmap, so we can compare and contrast the therapies that we do can be compared to see which is better, needs to be improved. And then second hand, it's just many things are driven by profits and money. So there are lots of things that have been done that may not be as good for the customer or the patient that they cannot evaluate. So coming from that angle, also it's important to have some type of framework and regulations. And in the United States, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, is the main entity actually that has the authority to regulate and they are the only people who have the power to shut you down, essentially say you're not doing a good job, we don't want you to do. So like a happy medium between having no regulations and having regulations is voluntary regulations. And so a good example of this is in the field of blood therapies. So many of the cell therapies that we talked yesterday are still trying to develop, but blood has been done for a long time. So I'll talk a little bit about it. But voluntary regulations are more type of accreditation. So all the stakeholders, so for example, in the area of blood therapy, back in early 2000s, when the FDA indicated they would like to start putting some regulations, so the stakeholders, physicians, patient advocates, people who are developing these therapies, pharmaceutical companies got together and formed an entity. It's called Foundation for Accreditation of Cellular Therapy, FACT. And now it's been almost 20 years, about 18 years since it's been in place. It's worked relatively well. Like always, sometimes we try to overregulate things, even accreditations. So, but overall, there are issues, but overall it's worked quite well. And I do go and visit other, and now it's become worldwide actually. So cord blood industry, for example, it's voluntary to have accreditation, but having accreditation means something because then the customer, the patient knows it's gone through an independent review of what they do. And so when I go and inspect other cord blood banks, for example, around the world, not only we look at what they do, essentially it's a very detailed checklist of about 100 questions. They are given to answer those questions. And as an inspector, I go and look at whether they fulfill those requirements. And actually that permeates to every aspects of an operation, not only manipulating the cells in the lab, but also it permeates to how you label and how you market it. So we also look at the website of these cord blood banks, how they market it to the patients, saying, we will store your cord blood bank for use down the future. And sometimes they say things that are not maliciously, but they overstate. So we request that they take it down because some of the therapies that are not proven, you cannot claim those types of aspects. So it's more of a back and forth, voluntary, and then usually it's very friendly and it's not punitive. And then once you are accredited, then you can use the logo and the patients know that this is an accredited facility. So that's the happy medium. So as opposed to being punitive or having strict regulations. So what's the motivation for regulation? So according to the FDA and European Medicines Agency, EMA, are the two main entities in the world that regulates. Of course, Japan has its own entity. Those are like the main three. This is the reason that they prefer to have this type of regulation to make sure the products, especially cell therapies, are sterile so that the patients don't get infections. And what you're putting have an identity. What are you putting into the patients? Like I explained yesterday, the liposuction methodology pulls everything, not just the stem cells. Good, bad, I mean, things that are not needed. So the identity is important, then how pure it is, that's important, and how the potency and stability. So the entire framework of the United States FDA came about because of this potency issue. So before I go into that, this is the US FDA, how it's organized. It regulates all aspects of food and drug. And so the ones that I'm going to focus on is right here. It's called CBER, Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research. All the cell therapies formed under here. Then, of course, there are veterinary, and also this is the biggest arm, which is the small molecule drugs. So I'm focusing on right here on CBER aspects. And then within the CBER, it's further organized. And right here, these are the aspects that I'm going to, again, the things that we are talking about today and yesterday. Regenerative medicine, cell therapy falls under these two categories, mostly. So most of the discussions, regulations, the INDs, they all happen within the purview of these officers. And so I'm going to give you one slide of history. So like I mentioned, by nature, FDA's regulations come as a reaction, not proactive. It's good and bad. So people are so creative, they cannot think of every aspect of way people are coming up with therapies. So once somebody does something, then they think, okay, we need to think about this better. So the original 1902 was the first time that the US government thought we should regulate. And why did it happen? That happened because at that time, people were getting diphtheria toxins, and there was a whole host of patients. The vaccine never worked. So that's when they say, why? Because those were outdated and had no potency. So that's when they thought we need to start putting some rules down so that the people who are getting these vaccines truly know it works. So 1902. And then the biggest, so based on that, now all the drugs require an expiration date after you manufacture a drug. And the next big changes came in 1944, and it introduced this concept of potency. If you're giving a drug, it needs to be what's its strength and does it work? So they required drug makers or cellular therapy makers to make this type of potency. And then 2001 is where the cell therapies came into being. And the way usually the FDA works is they do not come and put down regulations. They give about, usually, this was actually 4-year time interval when they first said that they want to try to have all the stakeholders come into place and discuss what type of rules are needed. And based on thousands of comments by thousands of physicians, cell therapy, pharmaceutical companies, they came up with the 2005, which is called the final rules. So up to now, mostly it involves the blood-related therapies, but it's extended to other types of cell types too since 2005. And so it's called 21 CFR 1271. So when my facility gets inspected by the FDA, they follow the guidelines set forth by 1271 guidelines. And so these are actually the currently approved tissues by the types of stem cell products that are approved by the US FDA. And the last few slides, I will talk about the European Medicines Agency, but my knowledge is mostly FDA. So I'll focus on the FDA, but many regulations, actually they work hand in hand with some distinct differences. Most of it's what FDA does, EMA follows. In certain cases, what EMA, European Medicines Agency, put forward, then FDA takes note of that. So it's, they work hand in hand together. And so one other thing I want to mention is, unlike yesterday's my talks, I don't claim to be an expert in this area. I'm just presenting you the data, and I'm willing to have a discussion. But on my experience, even the FDA inspectors do not have all the answers. These are still developing rules and developing things, so it's like, it's very open for discussion and interpretation, with some exceptions. Some people take it a little too far and interpret things a little more broadly than they're intended, but overall, it's very fluid. And one of the reasons it's fluid is it's intentionally left fluid, because they cannot anticipate all the therapies that come through the FDA for approval, and they have to adjust their regulations to meet the demand of the patient's need. The last few slides also I will talk to you about. The last year, they again expanded the rules with the new US. These are laws, actually. These are not suggestions. These are actually US Congress passed laws. So last year, there was another new law to cover some of the newest therapies that are coming through. But most of things are in a broad category. You can fall into two areas, what's called 361 and 351. These numbers pertains to the law, where the description of the regulation. So that's how 361 means, under this section of the law, any cells that are used for therapy that's minimally manipulated falls under 361. And also it's intended for homologous use. For example, using bone marrow stem cells to do a transplant is a homologous use, and also it's very less manipulated. So these are some of the examples, and also broadly, it also includes some of the tissues, bones, ligaments, tendons, a whole host of other things. All these tissues, the number one criteria in this section they are looking for is, are these products sterile? In other words, because these are biological products, you cannot make them sterile by autoclaving or putting bleach, for example. So you have to begin procuring these in a sterile environment. So that's where these regulations come. The next one is 351. 351 applies to drugs and biological products that are, once you start culturing, purifying, manipulating, they fall under 351. Also, broadly, they include the immune therapy, gene therapy products, human cloning, blood. So the other thing most of us, sometimes I including myself, get confused is this aspect. Cell therapies under 361 does not require pre-market approval for clearance. In other words, you do not have to apply to the FDA to get permission if it falls under 361 to commercialize a product. So typically when you do a stem cell transplant for leukemias or bone marrow, you do not get permission from the FDA. They are considered standard therapy. So I'm going to talk the next few slides about this. Effective last year, because so many things are moving forward so fast, especially in terms of CAR T cells, like modified T cells for cancer therapies, for example, and also mesenchymal cell-based therapies. They formed this new office called, throughout my talk, there are going to be a lot of acronyms. So I'm still getting used to all these OCT, GT, OT, AT. So they are all different parts of the FDA, but the new therapies all fall under tissue and advanced therapies. Actually, if you superficially think about this new regulation, looks like it's even more regulation. Actually, it's the opposite. The reason that they formed this was to speed up the approval process. So if you think you're developing something under this category, the FDA wants it to come to the patient very fast. So they have created this mechanism to bypass the regular ways of going through approval process. In other words, you can shorten the phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials. If you see something is working really fast, they will get it approved very fast. And so the good example is the CAR T cells that were approved 2 weeks ago. So it's very, very unusual to commercially make it available a product after only treating 63 patients. So the approval was based on 63 patients, but the efficacy was over 82% response of the 63 patients, even though some of the patients have life-threatening side effects, because the impact was so great that they went through this fast approval process to get it into the market. And also, still they're trying to figure out where to, it looks bureaucratic and administrative, but it has a big impact which products are handled by which office, because these officers are employs physicians and other experts who really know the field from a scientific point of view. So going into the wrong office will be evaluated by a group of people that have very little background. So that's where this becomes important to get the product approved. So this is an example of products that fall under this new category called OTAT products. So stem cell and stem cell derived products, that includes the hematopoietic, mesenchymal, cord blood, embryonic, and also iPSCs. My colleague will talk about iPSCs, which are becoming more and more mainstream of creating lots of different diverse cellular therapy products, from starting with reversing the direction from a stem cell. And then somatic cell therapies, that includes typically non-stem cell products, and then therapeutic vaccines and other antigen-active immunotherapy. So this is the area that's starting to really explode in terms of different flavors and varieties of cells, especially for various types of malignancies. And then gene therapies also fall into these. That includes viral vectors and bacterial vectors. I'm not going to go into detail, but actually there are a host of new therapies that are now under clinical trial, which is not cell-based actually, it's actual viruses. So for example, in my CGMP facility, we are doing a phase 2, phase 3 clinical trial with a PI it's a faculty in my department, but the company sponsoring it. It's a direct injection of attenuated virus for patients with glioma, malignant glioma. So many of these types of therapies are being developed to elicit your own immune system against these very, very difficult to treat cancers, especially cancers that are resistant to chemotherapy, like brain gliomas. So they all fall under this viral vector category. And also, one of the other issues, at least in my institution, we've started facing, some of these are actually viral vectors that are live viruses. So typically these are drugs that come through a pharmacy in the hospital, but our pharmacy says, no, we cannot handle these. We are not equipped to handle enough viral vectors or viruses in a regular clinical pharmacy that's used to dispensing small molecule drugs. So luckily we have a CGMP facility which has the isolation capability. So two aspects you have to provide. One is actually protecting the actual drug or the virus from contaminating the product. The other is the opposite. In this case, biocontainment is another concept that becomes important. In other words, you have to protect everything else and everybody else from the product. So that's kind of novel. Pharmacies are not used to doing biocontainment. They do not have, many chemo pharmacies have ISO 7 environments, because chemotherapies are mixed in a laminar flow hood. But other than that, they do not have the capability for biocontainment, containing the product from the rest of the environment. So those are the regulations that are new and coming out, how to not only protect the patient, in this case to protect the nurses, the physicians, the people who are dispensing these drugs. And then also, these are some of the other little more exotic kind of categories that you and I don't think every day, including anti-venoms. These are biologics because they are proteins. Also, this is becoming a little more mainstream. In other words, some of these products, biologics come in hand with actual devices. For example, so there are now new electroporators that are clinical grade. In other words, those are used to introduce the viruses and agents into the cell by pulsing the cells with electric pulses. So those devices are also coming under regulation. So devices for manufacture and delivery of cells, and including the delivery mechanisms, are becoming more and more automated. One example that comes to my mind, this is actually almost 7-8 years ago. Geron, a biotechnology company in California, developed methodologies to get stem cells differentiated halfway into neuronal cells and to transplant them for spinal cord injuries. But one of the biggest challenges, so these were for gunshot wound victims to heal. They had shown that neuronal progenitors can heal the spinal cord. So the neurosurgeon who was involved with that at our facility, I worked with him. And the biggest challenge was not the product, how to deliver it. It has to be delivered so precisely to the lesion where the spinal cord was damaged. They had to deliver a special computerized system where the drug was actually held by a little syringe, and only thing the surgeon did was hit the return button on the laptop. And we practiced using cadavers quite a few times. The neuronal progenitors got delivered exactly to the same depth of the lesion, and we were able to see it from a screen where it got delivered. So the company, Geron, spent more money not on the drug, but on developing the computerized system for delivery. So those are also going to be up for regulation and how they work, delivery of the actual cells to the precise lesion. So this is just overall giving an idea, at least in the United States, what the FDA is facing, the number of protocols that are coming through their office. So every protocol and procedure company or university submits, they have to give you an answer. Typically 30 days or now 60 days. If you don't hear from them within 60 days, a response for your application, that's a green light. That means you can go ahead and do the procedure. So usually they do respond within 30 to 60 days saying you have enough data to go ahead, or we want you to do a lot more before you go into a patient. And all these things go in hand with an IRB, which is called Institutional Review Committee. So each institution has to have its own ethical committee and have to be approved in conjunction with the FDA approval. So each place differs. Some places require first the IRB and then the FDA approval. Sometimes IRB says, you first get us the response from the FDA, then we will look at and give you the permission. Both needs to be in place before you can start doing these therapies. So this shows actually from 2009 to 2015, these are somatic therapy investigate IND. These are the applications for clinical trials, telling can we do a clinical trial. So the application number, so in the US, last year it's over 100 applications. So it's about 100 to 120 applications that are asking permission to do new therapies. And then this is gene therapy. The first one is only cell therapy. This is such a new category, but even gene therapies, around 75 new applications for 75 new therapies that they want to try has been coming through the FDA. And each one, can be very similar. Some of them can be identical, but it has to be evaluated on its own merit. You cannot mix and match other people's data. So all these therapies, where it is done, who does it, also is evaluated. Just because you do the same experiments or same mouse models or same study at 2 different institutions doesn't mean that both of them can be combined. They have to be evaluated by its own merits, and so that's why it's so many. And then, so these are the last year's new regulations that started. This is still not effective. These are mandates given by the US Congress for the FDA to develop in the next 5 years. So that includes these new sections called 3033. So it created a program for designation of regenerative medicine and advanced therapies. Also, it mandated FDA begins developing regulations regarding the devices, recovery, isolation, or delivery of regenerative advanced therapies. Also, it also asked them to start collaborating with National Institute of Standards and stakeholders. So this is the same process they are going through. They went through for blood in 2001. In other words, so if there are private commercial entities who, nothing wrong with making money, they are interested in making money by creating these products, they want them to come to the table, tell their side how they want it not regulated or less regulated. And if the case, they want them to tell why they don't want uniform standards. So the motivation for all this is the consumers and customers cannot make some of these decisions, even if because I've seen that firsthand when I go and inspect cord blood banks. They call up when a mother delivers and gives a cord blood product. If it's very few cells, they call up the family and ask, do you still want us to? They frame the question in such a way the answer is yes, because they are being paid a fee. So they want the fee because most of these cord blood products, for example, once you bank it until the baby is 18, every year you pay a fee to maintain that. And at 18, the product becomes the property of the child, and then he or she can decide whether to keep it. So those are to be fair by the customers, cannot make these decisions sometimes. You need more input. That's why that some of these regulations are being suggested. And then also in the context, many new definitions are coming into being. So somebody in Japan, somebody in Asia, somebody in South America and the US talk the same language. So to come up with a uniform set of naming and standards is also important. For example, by like next year, so this is nothing new. So most of your physicians are used to working with blood banks. Most of the blood products in the whole world is regulated by the exact same labeling and the same. If you order a unit of platelets, you know what you're getting because it's labeled in a certain way. Anywhere, Red Cross or any other place uses the same names. And cellular therapies are now also have the same language. So the labeling, although it's trivial, it also becomes important. So there's an international organization called ICBA. So by next year, this time, all the cellular therapy products that relates to, I'm not 100% sure about the regenerative medicine products, but many of the other cell therapy products have to have a uniform label. We cannot, when you prescribe, you have to have that label. So, and it's very, very well defined. So the same thing is happening with these RMTs, regenerative medicine therapies that are being suggested. And then the designation, why do you want this designation? So from an FDA standpoint, the reason, if you can develop a cellular therapy product that falls under RMAT and submit a protocol for approval for clinical trial, you get a fast track So already this type of a fast track is available, but as usual, people want to take advantage of what's out there. So what many things that may not fall under this, they are trying to have the FDA approve it faster, and but FDA looks at it in this way. It is a regenerative, if what you're submitting is a regenerative medicine therapy, and also if the drug is intended to modify, reverse, or cure serious threatening diseases or conditions. Also, the primary clinical evidence indicates that the drug has potential to address an unmet need. That's also important. I mean, if you're trying to come up with a new therapy that's already there is a cure or a therapy, then this system is not applicable to you. So if all these things can be met, then you can be designated as RMAT product. And also they are developing these new guidelines for this region by end of 2017. They will come up with the draft guidelines, and then all of us can comment on it. And usually they give a couple of years for these comments. And these are the guidance that they're going to put out in this December. Will address all these issues that I've put down here in yellow. I'm not going to go through every one of them here, but you can read some of these guidelines that they would take into account in proposing these therapies. And so what are the benefits of designating some cellular therapy as an RMAT designation? From a commercial standpoint, from a company, or from a person who's developing. Benefits available to breakthrough, and also early discussions, immediate endpoints to support accelerated approval. So this is the biggest benefit. If they accept what you submitted, fulfills a real need, then it can get through this accelerated approval, which is huge. If you're a small pharmaceutical company, if you can get something approved within a year, as opposed to say 3 or 4 years, that's make or break for them. I mean, they have a limited amount of money to bring the product. Even a shrinking of the timeline by 1 year is very critical. And then also you jump the queue. If you will priority review, your application will be reviewed faster, and then accelerated approved during the development is based on these 2 criteria. You have to have some data to show that long-term clinical benefit, or data obtain meaningful number of sites, including expansion of additional sites as appropriate. And then these are other aspects of this accelerated approval of the products, and also they will tentatively approve your product while it's been treated to patients. You have to keep submitting more data to see what your initial data that you submitted still stands true. And so it looks like a real experiment still, but these are products that are being used on patients who have no other options or no other cures. So this is all, these type of guidelines are developing because there's a lot of pressure from the patients saying it takes too long, especially for a lot of the neurodegenerative diseases, a lot of new anecdotal therapies, they want to try it out. So this is a mechanism to try out new things, and as a patient, you take some risk too, because you want to try a new option. It may or may not work, also it may also hurt you, but they are trying to create a balance between taking too long versus going too short. So I'm going to actually switch to the last few minutes of the European agency's regulations and framework, but many of the things that I'm talking, it's all public information. I do not, and most of these websites go through a lot of this information, and FDA has liaisons. There are physicians who are full-time employed by the FDA. They go around the world and provides forums and comes to conferences like this, and they are very willing and able to come and present and give their how they are trying to move forward. and also they learn in the process too. And so some of these things I already mentioned, the process itself. So there is a very, very clear process of putting these applications. And for these therapies, so they have 60 calendar days if you were to get this designation. And then they always communicate by writing. And if it's not granted, if your product did not get granted this, they tell you why. So you know why it wasn't. So this is some examples in the last year. So these are the different types of diseases. The green is the cardiovascular. So last year there were requests, 6 protocols, 3 for immune deficiency, then the others were all different other types, and neurology 3. These were the types of protocols that were submitted last year by specialty. And then, so this is the results of their FDA's decision last year. So only look at how many they granted, only 4. As usual, people, try to get ahead of the queue. So they submitted many, many more than they should have. But FDA reviews them very carefully. They denied many of these who were trying to jump the line using this new mechanism as a means to get it. And then there are 3 pending. Why were these all rejected to get this status? These are the reasons. Some were administrative, so they can resubmit back. Others were CMC issues, so their chemistry, in other words, the reagents that were used to produce the drugs, were not either compatible with human use or other issues. The study design was flawed or inconsistent results, so the results were not very, very convincing. And again, these are some of the other sites, including they give their email address. So they will, it's one of the, at least it's one of the few US federal agencies that are extremely responsive. They will not ignore your emails. They will not ignore your phone calls. They will respond to you within usually 30 days. So it's the system relatively works quite well, and it has a lot of benefit to the patients. So anyway, so I'm going to quickly go to the next few slides. Again, I'm not an expert at all on the European Medicines Agency regulations, but I'm going to give you how they are organized. It's different from the FDA. I have 2 more minutes, 2 to 3 minutes. I will quickly go through the EMA regulations. And just like I showed with the FDA, this is how the EMA is set up. And it regulates all these aspects, including the infrastructure like GMP, devices, the clinical trials, and the analogous to the RMT, the regenerative medicine products I mentioned for the FDA. These are the advanced therapies that falls under the same category for the European Medicines Agency. And this is a very, very cursory comparison between US FDA and the EMA. And I can also put a 3rd column for the Japanese Health Ministry. They also have very, very well-developed systems. Actually, the Japanese system is some ways more advanced than both FDA and the EMA in certain aspects. So all these agencies are learning from each other. So between these 2 agencies, in the EMA system is a little more, cumbersome, little more messy. Obviously, because EU has 28 countries, I think, and each country wants its own input. So it's difficult to regulate compared to the FDA. So EMA inspectors, or people who read it, assessors, are employed by all member states. And also it's remote assessment and discussion at EMA, because there is no, unlike the FDA, it's not one agency that employs everybody and one office, it's all over. And EMA more virtual communication, FDA is more hands-on. And so the product that will fulfill the regenerative medicine criteria is called 8TMPs. So this is the life cycle, how it goes through the process in the European Medical Agency. And you go through a certification. So it also has a committee for advanced therapies. This committee sees all the procedures and protocols that are coming through, and then it goes through this process with regulatory, scientific advice, also clinical trials. And also, in addition to the EMA, I think, depending on the country in Europe, it also goes through a national competent authority regulations before it can go into the patients. And so these are examples I'm showing. 16 such products were submitted to the European Medicines Agency, and 9 of them were authorized. So these are the ones that they had authorized. Some of them you probably recognize. You already prescribed some of these things in the US. But some of them, for different reasons, have been withdrawn, or in this case, it was suspended. So some of them, after you treat the first few patients, if you have unexpected outcome, then they suspend it for further review. Many of these are commercially trade names. So this just got actually, so Provenge, most of you are familiar. It's a T-cell product that's been activated to fight against prostate cancer. Let me see some of the other ones that this was, I think, this is an Amgen product that was just actually approved in the US a few weeks ago. It's for melanoma, if I'm correct. It's a viral-based therapy for melanoma that doesn't respond to other types of therapies. And then there are 2 more ongoing and 5 unannounced start in 2017. And I'm not going to go through all these, so I just to show you classification of products. I mean, this is what these agencies are dealing with. There's an onslaught of these therapies that are clamoring to get approved either for clinical trial or for commercial approval. And see, look at all the different description of what they are intended to be used. So for reconstruction of veins some of these products are for truly life-saving things. Others are for cosmetic purposes, for wrinkles, to getting you back to be 20 years younger. So the products are like all over the place. But they all have actual true repercussions to the patient. So I think there are more. I got rid of them. There was another whole list. So anyway, so I'm going to stop right here, but the future of regenerative medicine is still open. But there are lots of things that are going on, but also there's a whole, as usual, there are a whole host of less reputable claims have been made that you can treat from Down syndrome to lots of genetic conditions by injecting stem cells, from bone marrow to liposuction. And so you have to be aware, because certain countries have less regulations, so usually they are done on those countries, and the patients fly to these desperate patients needing desperate cures. We'll seek out some of these clear therapies that not only don't work, but like Dr. Vambazine alluded to yesterday, can truly kill you if it's with the wrong hands and the wrong person. May not be always, but it may be 1 in 10 or 1 in 100, but when it doesn't work, it's really can really bring down the entire field, actually. So I'll stop right there.